My name is Robert Chen. I've worked as a foreign correspondent in Asia for over 20 years. I've covered economic crises, natural disasters, and political upheavals across 12 countries. But nothing could have prepared me for what I witnessed in the Republic of Korea. I'm going to tell you a story that still gives me chills every time I think about it. It was November 2024, a cold evening. I was finishing my third bottle of soju with an elderly taxi driver at a small street food tent in Seoul. The news was bleak: soaring inflation, interest rates crushing households, youth unemployment at record highs. Headlines screaming, "Crisis," in every language. The old man looked at me with tired eyes and said something I'll never forget. "Young man, you foreigners always think we're finished. In 1950, in 1997. Tomorrow you'll think it again. But you know what? We're still here. And we'll keep being here." At that moment, I didn't fully understand his words. But over the following months, as I dug deeper into Korea's story, interviewing economists, historians, ordinary citizens, and more taxi drivers, I discovered something that Western media had completely missed. Something that completely changed my understanding of what truly makes a nation unbreakable. This isn't a story about economic indicators or GDP growth rates. This is a story about something far more powerful. Something that can't be measured by any spreadsheet, can't be predicted by any algorithm, and can't be destroyed by any crisis. This is a story about why the world's top economists, the ones who predicted every major financial crisis of the past 30 years, are now saying things that sound completely insane. Korea? Korea will be fine. In fact, Korea might be the only country that will truly be okay. How can they be so certain? What are they seeing that we're missing? Let me take you on a journey. A journey that begins in hell itself. July 1953. I obviously wasn't born yet. But I've read every available record, watched every footage, and interviewed dozens of survivors. The Korean War had just ended. And ended is perhaps too gentle a word. The Korean peninsula wasn't merely damaged. It was annihilated. I once interviewed James Morrison, a British UN soldier who was stationed in Seoul at the time of the armistice. He's now 94, living in a quiet cottage in Wales. His hands still shake when he talks about what he saw. "Bob," he said with a choked voice, "I saw the bombing during the London Blitz. I saw the devastation at Hiroshima. But Korea was different. It wasn't just the destruction of buildings. It was the obliteration of everything. No infrastructure, no economy, no hope. We genuinely believed, all the soldiers, all the UN officials, that it would take a century for this place to recover. If it recovered at all. The numbers don't lie. South Korea's GDP per capita in 1953 was $67. $67. That's not a typo. Lower than Ghana. Lower than Haiti. Lower than most of sub-Saharan Africa. World Bank economists wrote confidential memos. I found this in declassified documents, recommending that South Korea be classified as a permanent aid-dependent state. They didn't believe in recovery. They believed in managing decline. But there was something those economists failed to consider. I met a woman named Park Soon-yi. She's now 89, running a small rice cake shop in Busan. During the war, she was 15 years old. Her entire family died in the bombing. She survived by hiding in a drainage pipe for 3 days. When I asked how she found the strength to keep living, the will to rebuild, she looked at me like I'd asked the stupidest question in the world. "What choice did I have?" she said simply. "My family was dead, but I was alive. Being alive means fighting. That's not courage. That's just being Korean." That phrase haunted me. Just being Korean. I started digging deeper. What I found was remarkable. In the 1960s, when Korea was still one of the poorest countries on earth, literacy rates were climbing faster than anywhere else in the world. Parents who couldn't afford food were buying textbooks. Families living in shacks were saving every one to send their children to school. I interviewed Drive Heinrich Müller, a German economist who worked in Seoul in 1965. He told me an amazing story. I was sent to assess Korea's development potential. My report concluded they had none. No natural resources, no capital, barely any infrastructure. But then I noticed something that wasn't in any economic model. Every evening, without exception, the lights in schools and libraries stayed on until midnight. children studying, adults learning. I asked my Korean assistant why. He said, education is our only natural resource. I didn't include that in my report. I should have. It was the only thing that mattered. The miracle began, but it wasn't a miracle at all. It was something far more brutal and beautiful. Pure, concentrated will. Korean workers went to work in German coal mines. They sent every pfennig back home. Korean nurses went to work in German hospitals, enduring discrimination and homesickness, wiring their wages to Seoul. I tracked down one of these nurses, Kim Young-suk. She's now 78, living in Frankfurt. She told me, we worked 16-hour shifts in the darkest mines imaginable. The German workers called us, Die Maulwurf, the moles. We smiled and kept digging. We sent every mark we earned back home. Not for ourselves, for Korea, for our future. Thousands of young Korean women worked as factory workers in hazardous conditions. Thousands of Korean men built highways in Saudi Arabia, enduring 50-degree heat and brutal working conditions. And everyone, every dollar, every rial, all of it flowed back to Korea. At home, the government was ruthless. President Park Chung-hee was not a Democrat. Let me be clear about that. But he had one obsession: development, by any means necessary. I interviewed former government officials who worked under him. One said, the president would call emergency meetings at 3 a.m. He personally reviewed factory production figures. He visited construction sites without notice. If you didn't meet targets, you were fired immediately. It was brutal. It was authoritarian. And yes, it worked. By 1980, Korea was no longer a laughingstock. It was becoming a phenomenon. But the biggest test was yet to come. November 21, 1997. A date seared into the Korean consciousness. I was actually in Seoul that week. I was a junior reporter for Reuters, covering what we were calling the Asian financial crisis. Thailand had collapsed. Indonesia was in chaos. And now Korea, the miracle economy, was next. I remember standing outside the Bank of Korea headquarters. The atmosphere was apocalyptic. Foreign reserves were nearly depleted. The won was in freefall. Major chaebols were declaring bankruptcy. The IMF was about to impose the most humiliating bailout conditions in modern history. I sent a message that my editor in London still has: prepare for riots. Could turn violent. Have an exit plan ready. Every foreign correspondent in Seoul was preparing for the same thing: social collapse, chaos, maybe even revolution. We were all wrong. Catastrophically wrong. What happened instead is something that still gives me chills. I witnessed it with my own eyes. Let me tell you exactly what I saw. January 5, 1998. I was assigned to cover what the Korean government was calling the gold collection campaign. I thought it was a publicity stunt, a desperate, symbolic gesture that would accomplish nothing. I arrived at a collection center in downtown Seoul at 6 a.m., expecting maybe a few dozen people. There were thousands. Elderly women clutching wedding rings, wrapped in handkerchiefs. Middle-aged men with family heirlooms in small boxes. Young couples bringing their engagement rings. Children with gold necklaces they'd received as birthday gifts. I approached an old woman, probably in her 70s. She was holding a small velvet box. Inside was a beautiful gold ring, clearly very old. Through a translator, I asked her about it. She smiled, actually smiled, and said, "This is my mother's ring. My mother died during the war and left this to me. It's the only thing I have from her." I felt my throat tighten. I asked the obvious question. Then why donate it? Her answer broke me. My mother survived the war so I could have a future. Now it's my turn. Korea gave me everything. This ring is just metal. Korea is forever. I'm not ashamed to say that as a professional journalist. I had tears running down my face. But what really shattered me was this. Over the following weeks, Koreans donated 227 tons of gold. 227 tons. That's 3.51 million ounces. Worth over $2.2 billion at the time. This campaign was voluntary. Nobody was forced. Nobody was coerced. I covered this story for Reuters. But I also wrote a personal essay that my editor refused to publish. He said it was too emotional, not objective enough. I didn't care. I knew I had witnessed something that transcended journalism. I interviewed IMF economists who were stationed in Seoul during this period. One of them, a French economist named Philippe Moreau told me off the record. Bob, in my entire career, I've watched 43 countries go through IMF programs. 43. In every single one, there were protests, strikes, sometimes riots. The standard pattern is anger, resistance, eventually grudging compliance. But Korea? Korea had none of that. Instead, I had housewives donating, wedding rings and taxi drivers working double shifts to pay extra taxes. We had meetings at IMF headquarters, where someone said, "Our models don't seem to explain this." We literally didn't have a framework to understand what we were seeing. National pride as an economic variable? Collective sacrifice as a recovery mechanism? Those weren't in our equations. He paused and added, "That's when I realized we weren't saving the country. The country was saving itself." And some countries, have something in their DNA that makes them unsinkable. Korea repaid the $58 billion IMF loan in just 3 years. 3 years. The IMF had predicted 10 to 15 years. Once again, the experts underestimated Korea. But why? What is this something in the DNA? After the IMF crisis, I became obsessed with understanding Korea. Not just economically, but culturally, psychologically, historically. I spent months, actually years, interviewing historians, sociologists, psychologists, and ordinary Koreans. I learned Korean. I read Korean philosophy. I studied Korean history. And slowly, a picture emerged. A picture of why this nation is different. Let me share what I found. First, there's something Koreans call hanhen. There's no perfect English translation. The closest would be righteous anger, mixed with resilient sorrow. But even that doesn't capture it. Professor Kim Jin-hee from Seoul National University explained it to me. Han is the accumulated grief and injustice of Korean history. Centuries of invasions, colonization, division, war. But it's not just sadness. It's sadness that transforms into determination. Pain that becomes fuel. That's why Koreans don't just survive. They overcome with vengeance. We call this revenge success. Proving to those who doubted us that they were catastrophically wrong. I saw this principle everywhere. I met an entrepreneur named Lee Min-ho, who started a tech company in 2010. At his first investor meeting, a foreign venture capitalist told him, "Korean tech? Cute. But real innovation happens in Silicon Valley, Mr. Lee told me. That comment haunted me for years, but not in a bad way. Every time I wanted to quit, I remembered his smirk. Last year, we acquired his company. I sent him a polite email thanking him for the motivation. This wasn't an isolated story. This was a pattern. Second, there's the concept of jungchain, a deep sense of collective bonds and loyalty. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I was in Seoul again. I witnessed something remarkable. Korea implemented aggressive contact tracing. In the West, this was controversial, considered invasive. But in Korea, compliance was nearly universal. Not because of authoritarian enforcement, but because of something deeper. A Seoul taxi driver explained to me, "If I don't get tested, I could infect my neighbor. My neighbor's grandmother could die. How could I live with that? We're all connected. My freedom ends where your safety begins." This wasn't government propaganda. This was genuine cultural belief. The result? Korea maintained economic activity, while recording one of the lowest COVID death rates among developed nations. Third, and this is crucial, there's what I call the education obsession. I know Western media often portrays Korea's education system negatively. The pressure, the competition, the stress. And yes, those criticisms are valid. But what's often missed is this. This education fever is not primarily about status or money. It's about survival, about ensuring that future generations never experience the poverty and humiliation their grandparents endured. I interviewed a mother, Choi Sun-hee, whose son studies until 2 a.m. every night. "You think I'm a cruel mother?" she asked directly, "pushing my son so hard. But let me tell you something. My father couldn't read. He was a laborer his whole life. He died young because he couldn't afford medical care. My son will never experience that. Never. Even if he hates me now, he'll understand later. Education is freedom. Education is dignity." That's when I understood. This wasn't about getting into Seoul National University. This was about generational redemption. Fourth, there's something I've observed. That economists completely miss the pee-pally culture, the hurry mindset. Yes, it can be exhausting. Yes, it can lead to burnout. But it's also why Korea went from ruins to developed nation in one generation. Why Korean companies iterate faster, adapt faster, outpace competitors. A Samsung executive told me, in Western companies, a product development cycle might take 18 months. We do it in 8. Not because we're smarter, because we're hungrier. We remember what it's like to fall behind. We never want to fall behind again. This speed, this urgency. It's not just corporate culture. It's national trauma transformed into competitive advantage. But here's the ultimate question I wrestled with. Can this resilience survive prosperity? Can a rich, comfortable Korea maintain the fire that built it? This is what worried me in 2024. Because the current crisis is different. It's not war. It's not the IMF. It's something more insidious: the slow erosion of hope, youth unemployment, impossible housing prices, declining birth rates, the sense that no matter how hard you work, you can't get ahead. I met a 28-year-old Korean named Park Ji-sung. University graduate, speaks 3 languages, can't find full-time work, lives with parents, has given up on marriage, children, dreams. The older generation tells us we're lazy, he said bitterly, that we don't have their spirit. But they bought houses for $50,000 that are now worth $1 million. They got jobs straight out of university. We get unpaid internships and part-time contracts. How can we have hope when the game is rigged? I felt his despair. It was real and it was valid. But then something happened that completely changed my perspective. 3 months ago, I was in a small cafe in Hongdae, Seoul. It was 11 p.m. The place was packed with young people. Students, freelancers, startup founders. I was there to interview a young entrepreneur named Kim Da-bin. She's 26 and runs a social enterprise, helping elderly people use technology. But what struck me wasn't her business model. It was something she said, almost casually. Foreign journalists always ask if we've lost the Korean spirit, if our generation is soft. They don't understand. We haven't lost anything. We've evolved it. I asked her to explain. My grandmother's generation rebuilt Korea from ashes. My parents' generation made Korea rich. Our generation? We're redefining what success means. It's not just about GDP anymore. It's about happiness, sustainability, creativity. That's not weakness. That's the next stage of development. I was skeptical. This sounded like what every struggling millennial says to justify underachievement. But then I started paying attention to what young Koreans were actually doing. K-pop didn't happen by accident. It's the result of young Koreans taking traditional work ethic and applying it to creative industries. BTS didn't become global superstars by luck. They trained for years, worked insane hours, perfected every detail. Korean films didn't accidentally win Oscars. Parasite was the culmination of decades of young Korean filmmakers refusing to accept that Hollywood was the only standard. Korean webtoons and web novels now dominate global platforms. Korean gaming companies are industry leaders. Korean beauty products are setting global trends. This isn't coincidence. This is the same Korean DNA. Discipline, excellence, refusal to accept second place. Applied to the 21st century. I interviewed a Korean AI startup CEO. She told me, people think Korea's miracle was about manufacturing and exports. That was just Act 1. Act 2 is about creativity and innovation. And we're going to dominate Act 2 just like we dominated Act 1, not through natural resources, but through human resources, through our culture of excellence. But something even deeper is happening. I spent time with young Korean activists fighting for workers' rights, environmental protection, gender equality. These movements are fierce, passionate, uncompromising. A young activist named Yoon Seo-jun told me, our grandparents' generation sacrificed themselves for economic growth. They endured authoritarian governments because they believed it was necessary. We respect that sacrifice, but we also recognize that true development means dignity for everyone, not just GDP numbers. We're fighting to make Korea not just rich, but just. That's not abandoning Korean values. That's fulfilling them. I realized something profound: Korea's resilience hasn't disappeared. It's transforming. The old generation's resilience was about survival. The new generation's resilience is about thriving with purpose. And when I looked at how Korea handled recent crises, I saw this new resilience at work. During the COVID-19 pandemic, young Korean engineers developed contact tracing apps in record time. Young Korean designers created stylish masks that became global trends. Young Korean content creators kept people mentally healthy during lockdowns with creative online content. When the global semiconductor supply chain collapsed, Korean engineers worked around the clock to fill the gap. Not because they were ordered to, but because they understood the stakes. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Korea didn't just send thoughts and prayers. It sent practical aid, welcomed refugees, and Korean companies filled energy gaps for European allies. This is the Korea that global economists are betting on. Not the Korea of 1953. Not even the Korea of 1997. The Korea of 2024, a nation that has evolved beyond mere survival, but hasn't forgotten how to survive. Let me share conversations I've had with top global economists, the ones who predict financial crises, advise central banks, move markets with their forecasts. I interviewed Drive James Peterson, former chief economist at the World Bank. He told me, "Bob, I've analyzed dozens of economies facing population decline, debt burdens, structural challenges. Korea has all these problems. On paper, they should be in serious trouble. But there's something the spreadsheets don't show: institutional quality, cultural cohesion, adaptive capacity. Korea scores off the charts on all three. When you factor in these intangibles, my models completely flip. Korea isn't facing decline. Korea is facing change. And if history has taught us one thing, betting against Korea's ability to change is a fool's bet." Professor Marie Dubois from the Paris School of Economics added, "We economists have a blind spot. We can model capital flows, trade balances, productivity metrics. We're terrible at modeling national character. But national character matters. It matters enormously." Korea has repeatedly proven that traditional economic forecasting becomes irrelevant when you have a population that simply refuses to fail. They find ways we don't anticipate. They create solutions we can't imagine. It's not quantifiable, but it's real. Even the IMF, the very institution that once doubted Korea, has changed its tune. A senior IMF economist, speaking on condition of anonymity, told me, "Look, institutional memory matters. We remember 1997. We remember being absolutely certain Korea would need a decade to recover. We remember being absolutely wrong. Now when we model Korea's future, we include what we call a resilience premium. It's basically an acknowledgement that Korea will outperform what the fundamentals suggest. Because, well, they're Korea. It's not scientific, but it's accurate. So let's address the elephant in the room. Yes, Korea in 2024 faces serious challenges. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Birth rate is the lowest in the world. Housing prices in Seoul are among the highest income-to-price ratios globally. Household debt is concerning. Youth unemployment is painful. The education system needs reform. Gender inequality persists. Work-life balance is terrible. These are real problems. They need real solutions. But here's what I've learned from covering Korea for 20 years. Every time Korea faces a crisis, there are always experts, including Korea experts, predicting doom. 1960s, Korea is too poor, too resource lacking, too overpopulated. 1980s, Korea can't compete with Japanese technology. 1990s, Korea's chaebols are unsustainable. Dinosaurs. 1997, Korea is finished. 2008, Korea's export-dependent economy can't survive the global financial crisis. Every single time, and every time, Korea proved them wrong. Not through miracles, not through luck, through adaptation. I'm seeing the same pattern now. Young Koreans are choosing not to have children? That's a problem, yes. But it's also creating pressure for immigration, reform, better family policies, automation, and AI development to offset labor shortages. Housing prices are absurd? That's driving innovation in modular housing, co-living spaces, and political pressure for reform. Traditional jobs are disappearing? That's accelerating the shift to creative industries, tech sectors, and entrepreneurship. I interviewed Lee Chong-wook, a labor economist at Korea University. He told me, every generation of Koreans has had to Reinvent what it means to be Korean in the economy. My grandparents were farmers. My parents were factory workers. I'm a university professor. My daughter is a YouTuber making more money than I ever did. The nature of work changes. But the work ethic doesn't. We adapt. That's what we do. And I'm seeing evidence of this adaptation everywhere. Korea is now investing massively in AI, biotech, and green energy. Korean companies are leading in battery technology, the foundation of the electric vehicle revolution. Korean content is dominating global entertainment. Korean startups are scaling globally faster than ever. The Korean government, despite its problems, is actually quite responsive compared to other democracies. When there's public pressure, policy changes. When there's crisis, resources mobilize. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But is it functional? Adaptive? Resilient? Absolutely. But you know what gave me the most confidence? It wasn't talking to economists or government officials. It was talking to ordinary Koreans. I met a convenience store owner in Busan. He's 63, working 16-hour days because he doesn't have enough retirement savings. I asked him, "Do you regret it? All the hard work, all the sacrifice?" He looked at me like I was crazy. Regret? My son is a doctor. My daughter is an engineer in Singapore. They're living lives my generation couldn't imagine. That's not regret. That's victory. I met a 32-year-old woman, single by choice, running a successful online business from her small apartment. The older generation judges me, she said. No husband, no children, no real job. But I'm happy. I'm independent. I'm contributing to society in my own way. Korea now has room for different kinds of success. That's progress. I met a group of high school students, stressed about exams but also excited about the future. One of them said, "Yes, the pressure is intense. But you know what? I'm the great-granddaughter of someone who couldn't read. My great-grandfather would have gladly traded places with me." Perspective matters. These conversations reminded me of something important. Resilience isn't about having no problems. It's about facing problems with determination and creativity. And Koreans? They have that in abundance. So here we are, at the end of this journey. Let me tell you what I told my editor when submitting my latest report on the Korean economy. I wrote, "Stop asking if Korea will survive the current crisis. Start asking what Korea will create from it. Because that's the pattern. That's the DNA. Crisis, sacrifice, transformation, emergence. It happened in the 1950s. It happened in the 1970s. It happened in 1997. It happened during COVID-19. It's happening now." Foreign economists saying Korea will never fall aren't being naive. They're being empirical. They're reading history. They're observing patterns. But more than that, they're recognizing something that transcends economics. The power of collective memory. The power of shared purpose. The power of a nation that has internalized the lesson that the only way out is through. Let me end with one story. Last month, I was back in Seoul for what I thought would be my last assignment in Korea before retirement. I was sitting at the very same street food tent where this whole journey began. Different owner now. The old taxi driver passed away last year. But the soju was the same. A young Korean couple sat next to me, mid-20s, talking about their worries. Job insecurity, housing costs, family pressure. The young woman said, almost desperately, "Sometimes I wonder if Korea's best days are behind us." Her boyfriend was quiet for a moment. Then he said something beautiful. "My grandfather survived the war. My father survived the IMF. We'll survive this. Not because we're special, because we're Korean. That's what we do." The young woman smiled and raised her soju glass. "To survival," she said. "No," her boyfriend gently corrected. "To prosperity." They clinked glasses. The sharp sound of glass on glass rang through that small tent, and I realized that sound was the sound of Korea. The sound of resilience. The sound of a nation that refuses to break. My friends, I've covered wars, natural disasters, economic collapses, political upheavals. I've watched nations rise and fall. I've witnessed the best and worst of humanity. And I can tell you with absolute certainty, Korea is not finished. Korea is not even close to finished. Korea is evolving. Korea is adapting. Korea is doing what Korea has always done. Taking whatever hand history deals and playing it better than anyone thought possible. The world's top economists aren't betting on Korea's economy. They're betting on Korea's people. On the grandmother who donated her wedding ring. On the father working 2 jobs so his children can dream. On the student studying until dawn. Because education is freedom. On the entrepreneur who fails and fails and fails until success becomes inevitable. On the activist fighting for a better Korea. Not just a richer one. On the young couple choosing to hope. Despite every reason to despair. This is why Korea will never fall. Not because Koreans don't face problems. But because when Koreans face problems, they don't ask, can we survive this? They ask, what will we create from this? And that, my friends, makes all the difference. I'm Robert Chen, 24 years as a foreign correspondent. 47 countries covered, presidents and paupers, billionaires and beggars interviewed. And if there's one thing I know for certain, one thing I'd stake my entire career on, one thing I'll tell my grandchildren, never, ever bet against Korea. Because you will lose. History has proven it, and history will prove it again. To everyone facing their own battles today, remember you are descendants of survivors. You carry their strength, you embody their resilience, you are unbreakable. From a foreign correspondent, who learned what true strength really means.